Welcome to the Corporate Venturing Insider Series, where I interview top practitioners in the CVC world and learn with you the best practices and golden nuggets that they have accumulated over their career. In this episode, we will be learning from Claudia Zeisberger from INSEAD. Claudia, could you take a few minutes to share your story and how you got to where you are today?
Thank you very much, Nicolas. So what interests me on the corporate venturing side and in the widest sense? It probably started about 5-6 years ago when we saw at INSEAD, and specifically me, because I look after anything private capital related, more and more interest emerging from the traditional corporates, and not necessarily from the tech corporates, but from the consumer corporates, banking corporates, and so on, that came to us and said, we would really like to talk about corporate venturing. And I use that term at this stage really broadly in the widest sense, and help our board think through that. Should we be part of it? If we dip our toes into it, how can we do it in a way that is potentially as de-risked as possible? Because we want to be part of it, but we want to experiment with it. And does it mean we should do corporate venture capital? Should we set up an incubator or an accelerator? Should we just focus on merger and acquisitions and just pick and choose? And by the way, how do we create the right kind of sample menu to pick and choose from if we want to play on that end of the spectrum, if you like? It became clear that there was more and more demand. As you see more and more corporates asking the same question, obviously, we're realizing that there's really a role to be played. So we then brought a few corporates around the table. We started looking into an executive education program, which we launched in February this year. And so that's on the INSEAD side. On the personal side, I've seen basically story around corporates really evolve. And not just from the conversation with the boards, but also from questions from the startups that I'm engaging with. More and more startups would come and say, hey, Claudia, we're raising our next round. And we have a couple of term sheets, but one of the term sheets is a corporate behind it. Can you help us even think about this? Should we consider them? Is this a good investor? Because you're always adamant, as I am usually in my conversations, that venture investors need to bring more than just capital to the table. Money is not a differentiator anymore. I think in 2021, that's probably more true even than in 2016. So there was basically that interest as well. And then as I started reaching out to some of the corporate VCs who were already in the game, I had often conversations that went along the line, yeah, we've been doing whatever we're doing, but it's not working. Or we think we should do better. Or we haven't really achieved what we wanted to achieve. And that always became an interesting conversation for me, because then obviously my question would be, putting my academic hat on, let's collect what's not working, or let's try to find those that have made it work. And maybe there's value in sharing it. And that has been a really interesting journey, I have to say. I would have never thought in 2015-16 that we would see such a kind of hockey stick chart projection in terms of new CVCs coming in, money being deployed out of CVCs, number of deals being done, percentage of CVC deals in the US. It's stunning, I have to say. I was positive about it. I was excited about the corporates coming in, but I would have never thought that it would grow that much.
It's extremely surprising that there's such an uptick. It's really faster than anything that one could expect. And so maybe the question I'm going to ask is the toughest one. Why do you think there's such an uptick?
So I think corporates nowadays have no choice. And what I mean is they have no choice to step out and be aware of what happens outside even their own ecosystem. So they cannot afford to lose sight of the developments, the potential threats emerging from the outside. So I think at an absolute base minimum, corporates need to observe what is happening in the startup ecosystem. And this basically includes not just startups that are really close to what they're doing, what we call Horizon 1, but you need to really think about what you do in your context in a much more global, broader, wider sense. So we're going from Horizon 1 all the way to Horizon 3. How you do that, though, is a complete different conversation. So there are many ways on how you can engage and be aware and observe that ecosystem. You can remain an observer, but obviously, as always, the more hands-on you are, the more you get involved, the more you're willing to engage and potentially make mistakes and learn from them as well.
Yeah, I think it's very provocative. They have no choice. So I'm at the Global Corporate Venturing event today in Monterey. I met with many CVCs. And it's to the point where when we talk to fellow CVCs, we're like, it would be very hard for us to understand why a Fortune 2000 does not have a CVC today. We're getting so much learnings and insights we can share back to the mothership. Can you think of any single reason why a Fortune 2000 should not have a CVC?
It starts with a clear definition of why you want to do that. And it starts by asking yourself on the board level, what do we think we're missing? So what do we think we're missing? And then which part of corporate venturing can help us to close that gap? So what are we missing? Are we missing visibility? Are we missing real execution? Would our R&D team, would our engineers, our internal team, would they benefit from some engagement with some external engineers, maybe with some devil's advocates? So at regular intervals, you need to ask yourself, whatever you think you're doing internally, whatever knowledge you're gathering, whatever awareness you have, is it still appropriate? Is it still timely? Maybe is it still enough?
I think you gave a really good, sophisticated answer because I was thinking about two very good companies that keep innovating that don't have a CVC. There's no Apple Ventures and there's no Tesla Ventures. And they would fit in what you would argue are companies that have managed to keep innovating. Maybe a CVC is not what they need and they have all the right antennas to do it, but most companies don't have that. And therefore a CVC would be a smart tool in the innovation toolset.
Yeah, I think it's a good starting point to just ask yourself in terms of intelligence. How much are you gathering? How much are you aware? Or basically, you can also do a post-mortem and ask yourself in the last 5 years, how often have you been disrupted? How often have you been surprised by developments? So the more often that happens, the less likely you can argue that whatever you're doing in terms of intelligence gathering is still enough.
Very nice. And earlier you mentioned you have more and more corporate VCs coming to you saying it's not working. And here I want to understand how much of that do you think comes from not having defined the why and how much of that is more on the execution side?
I would argue it's probably 75, 80% execution, but there is a significant portion still on the why. And to give them credit, maybe there was at one point a conversation around the why, but in the meantime, the internal champion has changed, the CEO has changed, maybe the whole economy around it, the whole environment has changed. And they just never went back to the why. So I think there is the why at the beginning when we set out, as we just discussed, but also there's a regular circling back of saying, is our why still appropriate? Is it still meaningful what we put out as a target? But I firmly believe execution is ultimately make or break, at the risk of sounding very German. As we know, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face, right? So let's basically look at execution. One thing is super important to understand in the context of corporate venturing. One element of execution is probably the most important one. That's the internal communication, the internal PR most, so that it's very clear to all your business units. What is this corporate venture capital thing doing? What is this team doing? When should I go to them? Is there something where they can actually help me as the leader of a business unit to execute on my KPI? In which case, you obviously, if you can argue that and explain that, you will have incoming requests. But also, there has to be a relationship building mode inside the CVC, almost maybe an internal PR head that basically goes around and says, this is what we're seeing. Is this interesting for you? Or ideally someone that knows exactly when he or she comes back from a conference, from a conversation with a startup, potentially to say, I know exactly who I need to talk to inside the organization. So I think the connectivity internally will, over the mid to long run, make or break a corporate venture capital effort. Now, let me just put it into context. And one of my colleagues has done research on that. Looking back in 2015, the failure rate of corporate venture capital investors was tremendous. So she showed that 80% of corporate venture capital vehicles or efforts closed down within less than 5 years. And I always get asked about why is that? And my answer is that it has to do with the tenure of CEOs. New CEO comes in, new sheriff in town, new different vision on execution and so on. And since the CVC is usually considered non-core, it's an easy one to open and close very quickly. But I think at that point, and as the leadership change happens, it's super important to have shown that you have your kind of tentacles inside the organization as well. You have your connectivity. You need your kind of fan base internally that will come back and say, no, we need those guys. They're really useful. They may be useful only once or twice a year to us, but when they're useful, they're really useful. This is good information for us to have.
I think you have given a few golden nuggets, as I call them. I really like the concept of internal peer. And it's interesting because in the last 2 days, I probably talked to more than 50 CVCs in different groups. And the many that are challenged inside the mothership, inside their corporation, is really because they haven't articulated wide enough what they are learning and sharing back to the organization. And some of them do really well to share the information, but they only share it to the C-suite, which means that the people in the middle management who are actually in charge of the P&L challenge why there is a CVC. And so I think the internal peer concept is extremely important. And I think what you're saying, and I'm going to add some granularity and then we will double click on it. There is one part of the internal peer, which is about sharing what you learn. So you show the value of the corporate VC from a strategic value point of view. And then there is the other one, which I think is what you implied by tentacles, which is all this connecting tissue between you and the organization and the portfolio companies and maybe even startups you don't invest in, but you engage with. So with that granularity in mind, how much of the internal peer should be about the strategic value you bring and all the connecting tissue with startups that you bring? And you could argue both are strategic value, but they have very different angles in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. So on the internal part, I think you really need to balance it. It's always easy to test this. So if you say, okay, this is a spectrum and where should the lever sit, right? Internal kind of communication versus connecting with the outside. I don't think you can move the lever to only one side or the other. If you're only engaging with startups, then you're not going to get to your next fund or you're not going to make it even to year 4. On the other hand, if you're purely inward focused, that's not your role. And then you're not bringing that knowledge, your intelligence gathering, your funnel will run dry very quickly. So I would argue the engagement has to be balanced. And maybe at the beginning, when you're kicking off, let's say you're a startup CVC, you clearly need to ensure that the message goes out to the broader ecosystem. We are here. We're new. Please engage with us. As we know, disregarding CVC, just on the VC side, what separates the good from the not so good VCs, it's deal flow, especially if you're playing on the really early stage. There's no way to really find those startups. You don't know which garage to look at around the globe where the new innovation is happening. So you need to create a certain visibility to the outside. So if I'm a consumer startup, I know exactly which consumer parent companies have a CVC that I should be talking to. So that has to go out, and that's potentially a starting point. But on the other hand, it's also crucial because that generates the funnel for you then to filter the knowledge and then distribute it internally as well. So you also have a certain filtering mechanism, but it does require a certain balancing act. And it also requires that you have a team that obviously is skilled and at either collecting information distributing, or both, depending on how you're structured internally. So yeah, the external communication is a really tricky one. And obviously there, I should add, your credibility to the outside, to the entrepreneurial ecosystem, will be built over time because it grows as you engage with entrepreneurs. As you work with them, word will spread. As you lead that startup potentially to not only its next round, but maybe even to an amazing exit. And the exit may have nothing to do with your corporate. And to be honest, by that time, that exit may have turned out to be not even relevant for the corporate. But you have built your credibility in that ecosystem that you actually can handle a startup and that you are a good investor, a nice investor, that the startup entrepreneurs will say, yeah, we wouldn't mind having them on the board. We wouldn't mind having them on the cap table.
What would you advise to all these thousands of new CVCs that are being created in the last 2 years in making sure they don't make a mistake? Where would you guide them to make sure they don't make mistakes, but also they are going in the right direction?
So first, I would say, don't ignore history. Learn from the mistakes and learn from the success stories that have been made in the past. There is a reason why certain VCs are still around, CVCs are still around, and why others are not. So keep an eye on that. History may not repeat itself, but certainly there are lessons to be learned, and certainly it rhymes in some form or the other. I would basically advise them as well to be very clear with your corporate what they would like out of you, and ensure that this clarity is being double clicked on, as you call it, that we go back and that we're still aligned with the mandate. Then also be very clear with the startups that you're engaging in. Don't overpromise, always over deliver.
So let's change gear a little bit and talk about diversity. How do you see the trends today? And it nearly feels like sometimes a pendulum. So you see improvement and you start to feel good about it, and then it starts to go back. How do you feel about building the right practice or the right support so that diversity has a fighting chance to last versus just being on the upswing and then come back?
Yeah. The trend towards diversity or across the board, diversity, equity, inclusion is clearly there. I'm usually a glass half full kind of person, but maybe I'm too optimistic. But I think from some of the developments that I've seen, it may have a bit more staying power than similar efforts have had in the past. So let me point to a couple of things. Number one, even though the starting numbers may not look good right now when we look at diversity and on the VC side, diversity on the startup side, female founders, and so on. So number one, this has become a very clear talking point. I've seen LPs ask VCs during fundraising, what is the composition of your existing portfolio? So how many female founders do you have? And I think the LPs are also getting a bit smarter. So not just how many women are in that startup, but how many female founders, which is a really good question to ask. So I hope all the LPs listening will do. But then the next thing, we've seen certain efforts. You've had in California efforts years ago on moving number of women on boards. I think by next year, every company must have added a woman onto the board. We're also seeing now that the conversation around diversity does not just stop with women. Now we've seen quite a few efforts being made on venture funds that are focusing on investments in founders from Latin America, which is something that is, I would argue, reasonably new. There are very few VCs that had that on their kind of mandate 5 years ago. We've also seen a lot more VCs that are focusing purely on female founders as a mandate. And there's a good argument to be made, aside from the altruistic one. If we're arguing that female founders receive less funding, that should mean as a VC that I should be able to A, get more deal flow if I'm willing to actively look for women, and B, I may have less competition when I show up to those startups run by women. So there should be a straight logic to it.
Actually, you make me think of one question, which I don't think we can answer because it means a parallel universe. But can you imagine if Google VC had insisted that on top of Larry and Sergey, they would have had to have a third female co-founder? what would Google be today?
That's a really interesting experiment. So we have a lot of alumni inside Google. I could do a survey amongst them and see basically, we get it from the horse's mouth. How would they have looked like? I have one startup I basically just had a conversation with, and they do have a female founder in it, but they're very on the deep tech side. And they're just basically saying, and I said, you guys just hired someone else, and it was yet another guy. So how many women did you have? And they said, we didn't have any women that even applied. Or we had one, and that became very clear this was not a good fit. We're doing our best, but this is what we're doing. It's hard for those startups to even create a starting point, right? Where they have female candidate or just diverse candidates. It's very easy for us.
We're getting to the top of the hour. Is there anything you want to tell the audience who are CVC wannabes or already practicing corporate venturing to really drive the industry to do good?
I would argue that anyone needs to nowadays keep closer eye on the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And if you feel, even if you don't want to be an investor, if you feel you need to engage or you want to engage because you have something to contribute, I think it's in all our interests that we make or that we help those entrepreneurs, of which we have arguably more today than we ever had before in history, build their new businesses, their new products, so they are sustainable, that they have staying power, and that they are ultimately participants in an environment and contribute in a good way to society. So if you would like to engage more, you want to just have conversation around it, I'd be happy to have that conversation and play your devil's advocate. But be warned, I will be asking tricky questions. So I will be asking difficult questions. It won't be a cozy, feel-good conversation on ESG in a cozy, hug the tree and save the polar bears kind of sense.
Okay, I look forward to it. I think you'll touch on what I think should be the ultimate goal of VCs and CVCs, which is to be impact scaler. Because the startups themselves are meant to be impact scaler, to scale impact, contribute to society. And a VC or CVC that does a good job is going to be this impact scaler of impact scalers.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I would also encourage, maybe on top of it, everyone, whether you're a startup, an investor, or an LP, share your experience, not it with everyone. Try to find a way to make your experiences, your mistakes, but also your positive learnings with everyone. I'm a big believer in open source structures. So put it back to the community and let the community react to it. Right now, we need it because right now there is no benchmark. So any experience that you can share is better than what we have right now. So if it has worked, that's great, but also share if it did not work or if you were disappointed with the outcome. I think that would be really useful.
This is a great way to finish a great interview. Claudia, thank you so much. That was amazing.
Thank you, Nicolas. It was a pleasure. It's nice to be on the other side. I get to be questioned. So I would be happy to come back. Look forward to seeing more questions.
Thank you, Claudia. Bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye.